I know that you're probably thinking when the passage was being read today, that's good, we're getting to the center of the argument where David's going to deal with circumcision, because I've been really struggling with that issue and how relevant it is to me or not. It's a bit like the head coverings in 1 Corinthians 11. When you go to preach on it, it's on the face of it, it's an issue that almost nobody is giving any thoughts to or struggling with. It doesn't crop up in their daily life. So I am confident that you're not struggling with that particular issue, and so my job is to try and make it lucid what Paul is saying to the Galatians about how big an issue circumcision, to circumcise or not to circumcise, how it's actually relevant to you and your spiritual journey and your walk. And I'm going to do my best. Don't know if any of you are familiar with the television program Ted Lasso. It's about an American who comes over and manages an English football team in the Premier League, and he's got to learn our culture, and it's very heartwarming. It's lovely. But there are underdogs. All great sports TV shows and movies are about an underdog, and they've got to try and find enough belief within their own team to rise up the ranks, and he has to inspire them. And since the earliest days of his time as the coach of Richmond, he's had this little sign over the door of their dressing room, and it says "Believe." And he put it up, and it always inspires them, and they've always done better. And signs are helpful in as far as they're helpful. But sometimes signs can actually get in the way and hold us back. Because in season 3, which I've just been watching, the sign falls down and there's an audible gasp, and they're thinking, oh no, we're not going to be able to perform or play good football anymore. But what actually happens is they find that they've been able to believe, and they thought it was because, in a superstitious way of relying on the sign, but they'd actually found the belief in themselves as a team again. They'd actually found the belief was not attached to the sign. It was just a sign, and that's all it was. And that's actually, if you can remember that, it's quite silly, but you might find it helpful as a way to remember what circumcision is all about in the New Testament. Paul's main claim is that this was a sign of belonging to God's family for a certain period of time. But now that sign's actually becoming a bit of a barrier, and it's creating hostility and division between different groups of people. And so maybe the sign isn't that helpful anymore. It's been a couple of weeks since we've been here, so a quick recap of the background. This is a small church in modern-day southern Turkey. They're new believers. They're mostly, it seems to be, kind of incomers, people who would have been part of the Roman Empire and pagans to all accounts. And they've believed in Jesus and his death, burial, and resurrection as the Messiah. They're enjoying this kind of new connection to God. And a group of kind of hardline Jews have come and said, that's all good and well, you can keep believing in Jesus, but you need to be circumcised to really, seal the deal, complete the job. And why were they doing that? They were doing it because they, as Jews, had a political privilege that they wouldn't have to worship the Roman Empire state gods if they could demonstrate that they were Jews. And so they're putting pressure on this group to say, you need to do that too in case you draw any attention to us and we lose our political privileges and freedoms. And so, in some ways, this is the climax. We're going to come to where the rubber meets the road, and Paul's going to say, here's the problem. Here's the real problems with circumcision. So all I want to do with you this morning, I want to first do what Paul says. I want to outline what are the problems that he sees with, why not just do it? It's just an act. It's just an identity marker. Well, it's not. And I want to think about these problems. And then there's about 3 of them. And then what we're going to do is try and see, once we understand them and the theology Paul's breaking down, how we apply that to ourselves with maybe 2 or 3 lessons as well. What's the first problem? In verse 8, Paul says that this kind of persuasion that they're coming under does not come from the one who calls you. He's saying, God isn't asking you to do this. God has called you. He's called you to faith. Your faith should be enough. You believe in the Messiah. He's not asking you to do this. Other people are. But if you go ahead and do it, you're going with the grain of something, a deep instinct within that takes us further away from God. Namely, you're stoking the fire of self, or building up the ego, or maybe in a word, it is going to promote self-reliance on you. Because you're going to think, I'm going to take this into my own hands, perhaps quite literally. I'm going to do this act that increases my sense of spirituality, my sense of nearness to God. And Paul is saying it's actually going to do the opposite of that. That reliance on the self is going to take you away from God. Do you know why? Because ironically, by this time, this is why signs are helpful in as far as they're helpful. In Galatia, or the Gallic country, I don't mean Gallic as in Scottish Gaelic, Gallic as in old France. It's a kind of ancient tribe and group of people. They actually had pagan rituals where the priests of the pagans would whip themselves up into a semi-conscious spiritual frenzy that would end in, guess what, cutting themselves. And even cutting their genitals sometimes. And I know this seems a million miles away, although our culture does some pretty crazy things too, but they would end up there. And Paul is fully aware of that. And he's saying, that doesn't actually come from God or take you any closer to God. And if you're going to be that obsessed with your own self and identity and your spiritual journey, then by turning in on yourself, rather than taking you into because this is all about who's the real family of Abraham, it's going to take you further into the pagan world. You're going to have more in common with them than you are with the patriarchs and the ancestors of Israel, even though you're trying to achieve that. I knew I was going to kick one of them one of these days. Do you see that turning in on the self, it's only going to stoke their ego and take them further away from God, because an increased focus and obsession with the self always takes us away from an awareness of the power, beauty, and goodness of God. So that's the first problem. It creates this self-reliance. And then the other thing that it does is in verse 6 he says, "For in Christ Jesus there is neither circumcision nor uncircumcision. None of it has any value." Now that's a radical claim that he's making at the time. But basically he's saying it's going to create a social hierarchy within your group. Now that's really important, because the church was birthed as an absolutely revolutionary group of people. It was so much more than just a religion, even as a social idea. I would argue there's still nothing really been as radical as the manifesto of Jesus and the group of people that he looked to build around his teaching and his way of life. Because it was meant to have complete equality of status before God. That is in many ways, the great unifying truth of what Jesus does. And what he's saying is, look, these guys are coming in and they are saying that they know better than you, and so they're already practicing a form of elitism. So you already have a hierarchy there. And then he says, if some of you start going along with that, what you're going to do is create division. You're also going to create this super spiritual group who are so much more enlightened and closer to God than the rest, or they certainly believe that they are, because they've gone through with the act. And they're separate, and they're different, and they're holier than thou, if you will. And he's saying the church is not to be like that. In Jesus, there is to be neither circumcision nor uncircumcision. There are to be none of those markers that separate us out. All those markers can do is come and bring division and chaos. Now, would you be surprised that since Paul wrote this letter, the church over 2,000 years has found ways to create different hierarchies and identity markers, and to separate some people and call some people more blessed and good and holy, and reject others? Of course we have, because we're sinners and we haven't worked this out perfectly. But that doesn't mean that we can't go back and discover the original ideal, and that we shouldn't keep striving for the ideal, which I'm already going into how we apply this a little bit. But do you see how he was concerned that this radical new project that the world had never seen was going to be undermined by them starting to create social hierarchies, playing the same politics of the world around them that you can find anywhere, games of elitism and who's at the top and who's at the bottom and who's in the in club. And he's saying it's rubbish, because that is not what Christianity is supposed to be about, and that is not why Jesus died. And similarly, and lastly, the third problem, not only does it increase reliance on the self, not only does it create social hierarchies and groups, but it also completely takes away the power of what Christ has actually done. In verse 2, Paul says, "Mark my words, I, Paul, tell you that if you let yourselves be circumcised, Christ will be of no value to you at all." And I would say this is the most serious problem with it. And this is why I would do my best to explain to you. This seems like a really esoteric problem from a long time ago in a very foreign and alien book and culture and all of that. But this is what it was really about, was Christ had come and had died on behalf of his people. And God had shown that he really was the chosen Messiah by resurrecting him again. And what he had then done was he had called people, all people, any people, who simply believed that he was God's chosen one, and to put their hope in him and what he did. And that was the basis of their acceptance before God. Nothing to do with who they were, where they came from, what they had done, or even what they do on a day-to-day basis. That was not the basis for acceptance. And what he was saying was, that is a beautiful truth that should unite Jews and Gentiles, and people from Galatia, and people from Corinth, and people who have grown up as pagans in the Roman Empire, and people who have grown up as devout Jews their whole life and know most of the books of the Old Testament. Do you see how all of that centers on all these people coming, and if you like, disrobing themselves of the things that they thought made them acceptable to God? Do you know? So if you were a pagan, that meant, okay, well, I'm going to get rid of the little idols and gods I have around my house. Not to prove my devotion to God, not in a... see, it's so hard as humans. Everything is we think about, well, what can I do? Just because I don't need them anymore. Because I found the way to go. It's through Christ's death and resurrection that I'm accepted. And likewise, for those who knew their Old Testament and their Jewish scriptures and they had their Jewish identity markers, the call was to not have to rely on this, either the act of circumcision or the diet that they kept and the foods that they ate or the times that they ate them or the times they were able to go up to the temple at certain times a year. It was to actually learn a new way where none of that actually made them acceptable to God anymore. It might have at one time, but Paul was saying, if you do that, you're denying that a new day has come. You're denying that the kingdom of God has broken in, and you're denying the powerful sign that God has given you that that's happened because his chosen one, his own son, has come to bring it to you. So he's saying you are all equal in that there's ideas and identity markers and there's stuff that everyone has to leave behind because it's not useful anymore because the new way of being accepted is here. So the problems are that it increases their self-reliance, that it creates social hierarchies, and lastly, that it takes away from the power and cancels out the power of what Christ has done, which is at the center of Christianity and the center of Paul's gospel. So, how do we apply that? Because we're not struggling, I don't think, with whether to get circumcised or not, and, or really anything from that sort of ancient playbook of religion. But if we think about the increasing reliance of self, well, I think there's something there for all of us, because as I alluded to, even as I was trying to explain a point to you, I found it hard not to explain it in a way that drew on self-reliance, and to try and make that clear. Because I think that's the tendency of every human heart, is to turn in on ourselves, to focus on ourselves to the exclusion of God and others. That's why the greatest commandment is to love God and our neighbour as ourselves. The ego is what we're all in a constant battle with and will be this side of eternity. It is, in some ways, some people more than others, but it is a raging monster within. And the death of the ego is a powerful antidote, and the gospel brings that antidote to it because it flattens everything out. And it says, nothing in my hands I bring, simply to thy cross I cling. Surrendering to that we need God and that we need others, which is one of the hardest things to actually do. And not all of these applications will be relevant to you, but some of you and some of us will struggle with that more than others. Probably the men will struggle with that more than others, of needing to rely on others rather than of ourselves. But at the center of the gospel is a call to surrender. And I heard an actor actually speak about it this week. It was somebody who had begun on a spiritual journey. His name is Rainn Wilson. He acted in the US version of The Office. And he was saying that he was terribly self-reliant. And when he learned, I think he picked it up from the 12-step program, when he learned that when you surrender and admit that you have no strength, and when you admit that you can't fully rely on yourself for your own spiritual peace, then that's when you actually find an incredible strength, because you find that it's in God and it's in the people around you. And that's the way the church is supposed to operate. Not a bunch of individuals doing their best to polish themselves and up and sort themselves out and create greater self-reliance, but rather divesting themselves of that, being open about the fact that they need God and they need Christ to forgive their sin, to nourish them and guide them on their journey spiritually through life, but then also that they need others. And so at the very center of it, that reliance of self, we all need that, and we can all apply that to our own lives for that to decrease, that Christ might increase, as Paul says elsewhere. And then I think the call for the church is, in terms of the social stratification and hierarchies, is to resist that with everything we've got. And some churches struggle with that more than others, but it's to always be looking as much as we can to push away any sense of elitism. Not thinking of ourselves as being in any elite club, not even looking to others as being in more of an elite club. Dare I say it, not looking to a minister or any spiritual authority as somehow being more elevated and elite. They have a different calling and perhaps different gifts, hopefully, but they are no different. You and I and all of us in this room, we're all exactly the same before the cross of Jesus. We all need that in order to connect and bring us back to God and give us peace with God. We are no different in that way. And sometimes church people, sometimes clergy benefit from those hierarchies and benefit from people thinking that they are different and better and somehow just more elite. And none of it can be supported when we take the gospel seriously and we see God's plan is radical. It's for this flattened out church where everybody sees themselves as equal before the cross of Christ, because it is about him and the fact that we all needed his salvation and needed him to bring us back to God, and none of us are any different in that regard. So that makes us, if we can reckon with that and take it seriously, we can reject any sense of hierarchies or social stratification in the church. I actually came across, it occurred to me this week as well, what this can say to us in terms of identity publicly. And this is really thorny, but it just wasn't lost on me, the relevance of the fact that Paul is talking about cutting and about mutilation. And I was trying to think about where that's relevant in our culture today. And you and I live in a very lost and very confused culture. And I'm going to be as careful as I possibly can in addressing this. I hope you would agree with me, and I hope it's evident to see from our news cycles that people are looking for a sense of identity. And they're finding it in all kinds of places. And I think the church has been asleep at the wheel, and we haven't been the best at offering that within these walls. We certainly haven't been good at loving and including folks who might be very different from us. And that, I don't mean Erskine Parish Church exclusively, I mean the church, particularly in the Western world. And so, because we're losing connection with the culture that we're in, folks, because everyone needs identity and everyone needs belonging, as we thought about before, and they're trying to find it anywhere they can. And two massive issues in our culture just now. If you read your newspaper or television or whatever, you'll read quite often about folks going under the knife for cosmetic surgery. So I'm not condemning that in and of itself. What I am saying is that some people take that so far because they're so desperate to somehow look and feel loved, beautiful, and accepted. You can read heartbreaking tales, and this is absolutely all over our culture just now, of folks who have looked to go under gender transition surgery, and they've lived to deeply and painfully regret it, and they're very angry at folks who should have been there to protect them, to check in on their mental health, and to steer them towards something that perhaps looked more like waiting to see how that would turn out, rather than doing irreversible things to their body. Now, I'm not saying that we shouldn't affirm folks, and I'm not saying that people do not struggle with their identity and their gender recognition within themselves. And I'm not saying that that's inherently wrong to support someone in all circumstances. What I am saying is that our culture is so lost and so lacks identity and being anchored that it's now being blown along with the tide of that, and it's leading to some young people being horribly failed. If you look at the likes of the Tavistock Clinic down in London, and it's immoral and it's a travesty. And I've threaded that as carefully as I possibly can because I don't want to be misheard or misquoted. Can you see the connection that in some ways, and I deliberately included this so that you'll see that this is more relevant than you might have thought when we first read it. Because people are still struggling with, what can I do in order to feel a sense of belonging and included? And we haven't done the best at taking our message seriously so that we're actually able to offer the hope of the gospel. Because if we took this seriously and we held it out as the radical, freeing, inclusive, accepting message that it is, anybody should, in theory, be able to come and with us to look up at the cross and to behold the splendor of it and go, I am accepted by God. The God who has made the universe and created the world and created everyone, created me, has loved me and died for me and given himself for me. And I know that's idealistic. But the only reason I stand here Sunday after Sunday is because I keep holding to that ideal. And I think there's more people that need to hear that message. And you and I are part of a faith tradition where we have that offer to give to anybody that may ask, that they are accepted by God, particularly amidst the confusion of the times in which we live. Is another way that that could be applied, I think, today. And finally, and most briefly, I think it's a call for us to continue to walk in faith together, because really Paul's overarching concern with this is that, guys, it's supposed to be a community. There's really not supposed to be ideally any such thing as private and individual faith. And sometimes we skew a little too heavy towards that. But this is an encouragement to, you know what, you're all the same before Jesus. So encourage and enjoy your faith together, because you'll achieve more, you'll enjoy it more, you'll be more blessed, and there's other people who need your expression of faith as well. It actually matters because it goes to the heart of what the gospel is. The gospel is something that unites a group of people that might otherwise have not very much or even nothing in common, but it brings them under the shared understanding of who they all are before God. It brings their focus up to God and what he has done in order to demonstrate his great love for us, and it offers hope to the world that anybody can come and find their identity and belonging under that good news. May God bless his word to us this morning. Amen.